The envelope felt heavier than I expected as I picked it up from the pile of unopened mail. My mother's handwriting, neat, precise, just like her, stared back at me, and for a moment I hesitated, my hand trembling ever so slightly. It had been years since I had felt this kind of anticipation, the kind that gnaws at your chest and fills your stomach with a bitter mix of dread and curiosity. The small house I had grown up in, the house that had always smelled faintly of jasmine and vanilla, felt suddenly foreign as I tore open the envelope. The words on the paper seemed to blur at first, like my mind refused to process them. Then they snapped into focus. She had left everything, everything, to my brother. My brother. The one who had never lifted a finger without whining. The one who had spent his life in a bubble of indulgence, never noticing my efforts, my sacrifices. My heart twisted painfully, a mix of disbelief and anger. I read the paragraph again, hoping the paper had lied, hoping my eyes were playing tricks. But no. Each word screamed the same cold truth. All the years of helping her, the late-night conversations, the silent support, the tiny gifts I had saved up to give her, nothing mattered. All of it had been for him. I sank into the chair, feeling a tightness in my chest that made it hard to breathe. Memories came crashing in, uninvited and relentless. I remembered the birthdays she celebrated with fanfare for him, the trophies and medals I had won that were barely acknowledged, the time I had fallen ill and she barely noticed, while he was praised for the smallest accomplishments. I remembered the look in her eyes when I had tried to show her my college acceptance letter, how quickly she had smiled, but not really at me, at the prestige it would bring to her name. And now this, the final blow. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, though I refused to let them fall. I had long ago learned to carry my heartbreak silently, to swallow it whole and wear a calm face in front of her. But beneath the surface, rage bubbled like molten lava. How could she be so blind? How could she reward laziness and entitlement while discarding love and loyalty? I clenched my fists until my nails dug into my palms, my knuckles whitening. It wasn't just disappointment, it was a profound sense of betrayal, a betrayal that cut deeper than any argument or misunderstanding ever could. In the following days, I tried to reach her, hesitated, then stopped. I realized, painfully, that no words could bridge the gap this revelation had created. No explanation would erase the sting of her favoritism, no apology could undo the years of neglect. I began to pull away, first in small ways, then decisively. I stopped offering financial support, stopped checking in, stopped bending my life around hers. The phone calls I once answered immediately went unanswered. The emails I once responded to with warmth now sat unopened. Every reminder of her, the photos, the gifts, the little notes, became weight I refused to carry. It was liberating in a strange, hollow way. And yet, underneath the freedom, a quiet storm brewed. I didn't just feel pain or resentment anymore. I felt a simmering determination, a spark that whispered I would not let this betrayal define me, that I could reclaim some sense of power in a life that had often made me feel invisible. The first step was cutting ties, not with a shout, not with a confrontation, but with silence, withdrawal, and the deliberate choice to prioritize myself. And as I stood by the window, watching the sunlight scatter across the street, I realized that this moment, painful as it was, had awakened something inside me. Something fierce, protective, and quietly vengeful. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would no longer allow myself to be overlooked, undervalued, or used. Not by her. Not by anyone. The days that followed my decision to cut ties were both liberating and unsettling. At first I felt a strange emptiness where obligation and familial duty used to reside. No more calls, no more questions about bills, no more trying to smooth over her moods or appease her whims. Yet, with that emptiness came clarity, a sharp, almost intoxicating sense of freedom. I could breathe without restraint, think without interference, and make choices purely for myself. But even as I reveled in that freedom, the anger that had sparked in me during the reading of the will still simmered beneath the surface, a low, persistent hum that refused to quiet. I watched from a distance as my mother continued her predictable routine, her life moving forward as if nothing had changed. And then there was my brother, the effortless recipient of her generosity, flaunting the benefits of a life he hadn't earned. He squandered her attention, her gifts, and her money with a careless arrogance that made my skin crawl. I found myself torn between pity and quiet satisfaction. The very person she had coddled, who had relied on her blindly, was the one now facing the consequences of her favoritism, even if she didn't realize it yet. I began to notice the little cracks appearing in their dynamic, the fleeting frustration on my mother's face, the tiny sighs of disappointment she tried to hide when he failed to meet even the most basic responsibilities. I didn't rush to gloat. I didn't need to. There was power in waiting, in letting the consequences unfold naturally. I felt like a silent observer of justice, and that sense of control was intoxicating. I realized that my revenge didn't need to be loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, deliberate, and calculated, a subtle shift in the balance that would eventually make her realize her mistakes. Meanwhile, I immersed myself in my own life, building routines and small victories that belonged entirely to me. I found joy in simple things I had neglected for years: mornings with coffee and books, walks through the city streets without obligations pressing on my shoulders, evenings spent learning new skills or pursuing long abandoned passions. I didn't need her validation anymore, nor did I want it. Every small success felt like a reclamation of the life I had sacrificed for her approval, and that feeling became a source of inner strength I hadn't known I possessed. Even so, the phone calls kept coming, at first faint echoes of the past. Her voice, tinged with expectation, demanded attention I was no longer willing to give. Each unanswered ring was a quiet rebellion, a small victory in itself. Sometimes I imagined her sitting alone, realizing that the support she had taken for granted was gone, and a private satisfaction coursed through me. I wasn't cruel, I wasn't even angry all the time. I was deliberate. Every action, every choice was a statement I existed on my own terms now, and the consequences of her choices were no longer my burden to bear. There were moments, in the stillness of my apartment or the quiet streets at night, when I allowed myself to reflect on the depth of her favoritism. I could feel the sting of every overlooked achievement, every birthday forgotten, every word of encouragement never given. And yet, rather than drowning me, these memories hardened me, made me more resolute. I understood now that my distance was not just a reaction to betrayal, it was an act of self-preservation. In protecting myself, I had begun to reclaim a dignity that had long been denied, and with that dignity came the first taste of empowerment. By the end of the month, I had settled into this new life. I felt lighter, sharper, and more in control than I had in years. I didn't need to call or explain. The silence itself carried its own message. And in that silence, I nurtured the quiet knowledge that the next time my mother reached out, I would be ready, not desperate, not pleading, but calm, measured, and in full command. When she finally realized the absence of my support, the void she had so carelessly ignored, I would answer. And that answer would be hers to contemplate, a subtle but undeniable reminder that the way she had valued her children had consequences. The day the call came, I had been expecting it, though part of me still braced for the sting of old emotions resurfacing. My phone vibrated on the table, the screen lighting up with her name. I let it ring once, twice, before picking up, my hand steady, my pulse calm. The familiar warmth of her voice, the voice I had once craved approval from, was gone, replaced by a tremor I hadn't heard in years. Panic. "Where's my money?" she demanded, her tone sharp, brittle, as if the words themselves carried the weight of her disbelief. I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch, letting her impatience build. There was a moment, brief but profound, where I could almost feel the shifting balance of power between us. For so long she had been untouchable, commanding loyalty and devotion without question. Now, for the first time, she was on the other side of uncertainty, and I held the quiet control. When I finally spoke, my voice was measured, calm, almost gentle. I stopped sending it, I said simply, each word deliberate, precise. There was no hesitation, no remorse. She gasped on the other end, the sound sharp and incredulous. The disbelief in her tone was almost delicious, a subtle vindication I had long imagined but never thought I would experience. "I'm not supporting you anymore," I added, letting the words linger like an invisible barrier between us. She faltered, searching for some retort, some way to twist the situation, to appeal to whatever maternal bond she thought still existed. But there was nothing. I had stripped away the crutches she had taken for granted, and there was no scaffolding left to prop up her expectations. In that silence, I realized how thoroughly she had underestimated me, how long she had assumed that love meant compliance, that loyalty meant obedience. And now she was forced to confront the truth: I had agency, and I was unafraid to exercise it. As I listened to her sputter, to try and negotiate or guilt me into compliance, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and satisfaction. I had loved her once with a fierce devotion, believed in her fairness and her care, and now I was witnessing the consequences of her favoritism firsthand. It wasn't joy, exactly, it was recognition. Recognition that I had finally reclaimed the narrative of my life, that I had stepped out from the shadow of her whims and carved a space where I was no longer beholden to her. I stayed calm, refusing to be drawn into argument or defense. Every attempt she made to invoke nostalgia, to appeal to shared memories or blood, fell flat. I wasn't the child she had raised to please her, the one who would cry at her disappointment or bend under her criticism. I had grown beyond that, and the power that came with growth was intoxicating. I let her fumble, let her realize that the safety net she had taken for granted, my financial support, my unquestioning presence, was gone forever. When she finally fell silent, I didn't feel triumphant in the way I imagined a villain might. Instead, I felt the quiet strength of someone who had survived betrayal and turned it into empowerment. "Goodbye," I said softly, not cruelly, and ended the call. The phone lay on the table, still warm from her grip, and I allowed myself to breathe fully for the first time in weeks. Alone in the apartment, I reflected on the complexity of what had just occurred. Revenge had arrived not with fireworks or shouting, but with restraint, patience, and precision. It was sweeter than I could have imagined because it was earned, because it required neither cruelty nor malice, only boundaries and the courage to enforce them. I realized that this moment marked not the end of my story with her, but the beginning of my own. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to take control of my existence entirely, to stand apart from the expectations of those who had once held sway over me. And in that control, in that deliberate assertion of independence, I found not only satisfaction, but an unexpected sense of peace. The days after the call were quiet, almost serene. I no longer felt the tension that had haunted me during the weeks leading up to it, nor the simmering anticipation that had kept me restless in the nights before our confrontation. Life, in its subtle rhythms, began to flow around me in a way I had never allowed before. I was no longer defined by her expectations, no longer tethered to the invisible strings of obligation that had shaped my choices for years. The silence I had once feared became my sanctuary, a space in which I could finally breathe, think, and exist for myself. Occasionally, I would hear through mutual acquaintances or the occasional family update that she had begun to struggle. The money she had expected to arrive without question was gone. The indulgences she had always taken for granted were no longer freely supplied, and the reality she had never anticipated began to creep into her daily life. I didn't feel joy in her hardship. It was not malice that drove me, but a quiet acknowledgement that life, finally, was revealing consequences she had long ignored. The spoiled brother, too, was beginning to face the limits of his own incompetence, unable to manage what had been handed to him with careless entitlement. I found myself reflecting on the years I had spent seeking her approval, wondering how many moments of my life had been lost to trying to please someone incapable of fairness. And yet, I did not regret the distance I had created. In reclaiming myself, I had unearthed strengths I hadn't known I possessed. I was resourceful, resilient, and finally attuned to my own desires and needs. There was an unexpected peace in this clarity, a sense of dignity in knowing I had acted not out of spite but out of self-respect. The apartment I had long inhabited as a temporary space now felt like home. Every corner reflected choices I had made for myself, books lined neatly on shelves, a small collection of plants thriving in the sunlight, photographs and mementos that reminded me of the life I had built. Each item was a testament to independence, a quiet celebration of autonomy. And yet, in the midst of this newfound stability, there was a lingering ache, not for her approval, but for the possibility that love could have been different, that family could have meant support and fairness instead of favoritism and neglect. Sometimes, late at night, I would replay the conversation in my mind, the calm precision of my words, the pause that had made her realize the shift in power. The memory no longer burned with anger. Instead, it settled into a quiet sense of completion. I had done what I needed to do, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The act of withholding, of standing firm, had been my declaration I would no longer allow myself to be invisible, overlooked, or devalued. That declaration had consequences, not just for her but for me. It had created space for growth, for self-discovery, for a life unbound by the constraints of her favoritism. And in that space, I discovered something I hadn't expected: a deep, abiding sense of freedom. It was not loud or celebratory, it was quiet, persistent, and deeply satisfying. I could walk through my days without the weight of resentment clouding my thoughts, without the need to prove myself to someone incapable of fairness. The past, with all its pain, had shaped me, but it did not define me. In the end, the relationship I had once cherished was gone, but in its place I had something far more valuable: autonomy, dignity, and the quiet knowledge that I had chosen myself when no one else would. The mother who had once held sway over my life now understood, in her own way, the consequences of favoritism. The spoiled brother faced the reality of entitlement, and I at last was free, not just from them, but from the chains of expectation and betrayal that had held me for so long. For the first time, I felt whole, unshaken, and unapologetically myself. The past had left its marks, but those marks were no longer wounds. They were reminders of the strength I had gained, the lessons I had learned, and the life I had finally claimed.